and along with my colleague Donovan Grimwood from Tennessee, we'd like to introduce David Darling. He has spoken, I believe you spoke, was it last year in October? And you did such a great job that we'd like to have you come back. You represent the American Coatings Association. You're a vice president. You have 22 years, I believe. You have served on several environmental compliance issues, and you work with closely with the surface coating manufacturers and resin manufacturers. You have an MS and BS in environmental engineering from Syracuse University, sorry, and is a professional environmental engineer. So thank you very much for giving this presentation or being willing to do so. So I leave it up to you. By the way, leave your questions to the end of the presentation, and then once Dave's done, we'll have time to field questions and answers.
Thank you. I appreciate the introduction. So today we're going to talk about industrial surface coating operations, both hazardous air pollutant as well as volatile organic compound regulations that impact, factory applied or we call it industrial surface coating operations. Next slide, please. And we'll start out with HAPs, or hazardous air pollutant regulations. Next slide. So just a little bit of background. Many people, applicators or others in the industry, you may get the question, if you see a coating and essentially you see a HAP content, or you see a product data sheet, or safety data sheet, and you see a HAP concentration. If you ever wondered where that's coming from, that's from the EPA industrial surface coating MACT rules, and these rules apply to major sources of hazardous air pollutants. And today, really what I'm talking about are large coating application facilities. Imagine a John Deere, Ford, Chrysler, GM facility, very large, and by major source, it would be say a coating application facility that would emit or have the potential to emit 10 tons of a single HAP per year, or 25 tons combined. We call it industrial surface coatings. It could be shop applied or factory applied coatings. On the flip side, it's like coatings on your house. That's field applied. These are applied in a factory. So hazardous air pollutants. I provide a link here in the presentation. There's 187 pollutants or compounds that the EPA has designated as HAP. And the common, this is just a few, but the commonly found HAPs in coatings, toluene, xylene, glycol ethers, MIBK, ethylbenzene, methanol. These are essentially compounds within coatings that are further regulated by EPA, specifically these industrial surface coating MACT rules. And EPA promulgated the surface coating MACT standards, started in 1995 and generally finished the last one in 2004. Next slide, please. And here's a listing. So we have at the beginning here, shipbuilding and repair back in 1995. I'll just pick a few here. Aerospace coatings, again, it was promulgated finalized, put into regulation. Back in the aerospace, September 1st, 1995, and all the way to the last one, plastic parts and products. That was on 4/19/2004. And again, these apply, depending on the substrate, where the coating is applied or what substrate is being applied to, and it's a major source, one or more of these MACT standards could apply to say a factory. Next slide. So what we're really talking about today, or why are we talking about these, is that EPA is required under the Clean Air Act to complete something called a Residual Risk and Technology Review, or RTR. And EPA needs to complete this review on the MACT standards, which I just identified in the previous slide. They were supposed to do this within 8 years of the promulgation. And the whole purpose of doing this is to see if there's any reason why the MACT standards need to be made more stringent. And unfortunately, EPA missed those review deadlines by quite a bit. And several environmental groups sued EPA, and they came out with a settlement, essentially a sue and settle, and came out with some court-ordered deadlines, which I'll get into later in my discussion. So let's talk about what is residual risk. Is the first step that EPA will take to review these standards. And what they do is they do a risk assessment of potential downwind receptors or neighbors to a factory. And they look and see if the HAPs that are used in that facility, be it a coating manufacturer, essentially, the coatings being used in that facility, are they impacting the neighbors downwind? If so, if EPA can do the risk assessment and quantify that indeed there is substantial risk, then EPA could make the standards more stringent just based on residual risk. The second step is something called technology review. And that's where EPA will look and see if there's any advancements in control technology. That could be spray guns. That could be add-on control technology. It could also be new coatings technology. Is there something new that happened since the original rules were promulgated? EPA must, though, look at cost effectiveness. Is that new technology cost effective to essentially retrofit the existing facilities out there? And EPA has certain bright lines which they feel, or in the past, that has been cost effective. And if EPA can show, one, that there's new technology, two, that it's cost effective, then they can make the standards more stringent to, again, reduce risk. And then finally, EPA, they can also look at a source or an industry, and maybe when they did the original promulgation of the rule, they did not set a standard for some source within the facility that was not part of the original regulation. It didn't have a standard, but they can, as part of the RTR Residual Risk and Technology review, they could, pull in additional sources and essentially regulate those via these regulations. Next slide. So the general trends, as EPA have been, I'll go over the schedule shortly, but the general trends in these rules is that, one, EPA has generally found the residual risk associated with surface coating operations to be, and the HAP limits, to be protective, or there essentially is, they've determined that there really is no excess risk, and two, that really they're not finding, in general, most of the regulations, they're not cost justifying, more stringent standards or new technology. So bottom line, EPA really has not lowered the HAP limits based on the Residual Risk and Technology review. So the original standards still apply. They have modified, and I'll go through the bullets here. So in the wood furniture, EPA did impose a 1% formaldehyde limit in the regulation. I won't get into all the details. If that industry or that standard is of interest, I highly recommend do a search on wood furniture surface coating MACT standard, and you can see the rule. But there's an example where EPA did impose a limit. In the aerospace MACT standard, this is a little different. EPA found that in California, Ventura County Air Quality Management District had implemented a lot, 55 specialty coatings VOC limits. everywhere, everything from anti-chafe to special coatings that go within the fuel tanks of a plane. Ventura had already had these standards on the books, so EPA incorporated those into the revision or the RTR review of the aerospace MACT standard. So that was in addition to. A couple additional changes that we've seen, not the MACT standards, but EPA has prohibited the use of conventional spray guns in certain rules. EPA has increased the add-on control monitoring, record keeping, and recently they've been proposing that facilities retest their equipment every 5 years. I think, a little out of context here, but I think EPA, the way they've characterized this in the rules is that if you have like a thermal oxidation unit, especially a regenerative thermal oxidation unit, I think the concern is that from EPA is that once they do a test to essentially comply with these standards, right now on the books, other than state permit requirements, really don't have to retest those the control equipment. Sometimes the control equipment can degrade over time, so I believe that's why EPA is proposing to include the retest every 5 years. And a big issue is the removal of the startup, shutdown, and malfunction provisions. So when these rules were originally promulgated, they had exemptions in the rules when a facility was first starting up, and when it was shutting down, and if there's any kind of malfunction, be it the actual control device or something happened in the line, a facility could essentially not be exempted from complying with the standard during these special conditions. Because of a court decision, EPA lost that court decision, and now all the rules have to remove the SSM or startup shutdown function exemptions. Many states have done this as well in state rules. So what that really means is that if there is it doesn't really comply, facilities can either use compliant coatings, essentially that meet the HAP limits, or they could put on a control device. Many times that control device requirement is say 95% control. By removing the startup shutdown malfunction provisions or exemption, it means that that facility, if they're using add-on control, has to meet the 95% control 100% of the time. If they don't, then they could face fines for that. So it does make life much tougher for facilities. It's just something we have to deal with, but that has been part of the revision to all these standards. EPA has also incorporated electronic submittals of reports and notifications. Instead of being in paper form, EPA has incorporated the means that facilities can now submit those electronically. And then finally, hopefully everybody's aware that in a lot of these standards, when you define what a HAP coating is, or there's really a de minimis. It's the OSHA de minimis, 0.1% for carcinogens and 1% for other compounds. That's consistent with all the rules. And what that means for a coating manufacturer is that if I am buying supplies or raw materials from my supplier, really I'm only going to get information down to these levels of the 0.1 and 1%. So when they go to actually supply that information to their customers, we do the same thing. We use the 0.1 and 1%. EPA has changed that. They've removed the reference to the OSHA de minimis, and now they've included a table of HAPs that are potentially carcinogen that would comply with, or that would be applicable to that 0.1%. So I think the way the rules read now is that facilities would have to, would have to count HAPs that were on the new tables at that level of 0.1%. When essentially they add up all the HAPs in the coating, that's where they're drawing from that table at that concentration. Next slide. Okay, so here are the completed RTRs. These are promulgated or finalized. The shipbuilding repair that was done back in 2011. Wood furniture, 2000, again, same rule, same packet. And the 1% limit, EPA included a prohibition against conventional spray guns in the wood furniture surface coating MACT. I mentioned the aerospace that was completed December of 2015. And that's where EPA added, again, 55 specialty coating VOC categories or VOC limits from the California rule. They did include some requirements of what is a high efficiency spray gun. Fabric printing and dyeing that was completed 3/15/2019 also had requirements for high efficiency spray guns. And then finally, the large appliance and metal furniture rule was promulgated on 3/15/2019. Next slide, please. So we're still waiting on the rules listed here, and these are some of the bigger ones. Metal can and coil that was proposed by EPA back on 6/4/2019. Boat manufacturing, again, proposed back in May. That was a different one. EPA had included in that proposal to have spray gun training requirements for the workers that are essentially doing these big boat molds to try to. I think it was to try to. I think the onus was to try to increase efficiency of the the spraying. That if a worker knew how to better spray the resin compound. That would actually increase the efficiency and limit waste, and we'll see if that actually. I think the industry pushed back on that, but we'll see if that makes it in the final regulation. A really big rule combined is the auto and light duty truck, miscellaneous metal, and then the plastic parts, and that was proposed on November 1st, 2019. And the last one, paper and other web, was proposed on 9/19/2019. So if you go up to my title, I mentioned earlier that these are all under a court order deadline. So EPA must finalize these by, I messed up here. I put the wrong date in. It's supposed to be in March, I think it's March of, bear with me, March of next year. In March of 2020, all of these rules have to be absolutely positively have to be finalized and promulgated because of the court order deadline. I would think that EPA would probably start finalizing, first of the year. Many of these will probably pop out, but yeah, they must absolutely positively get these done by March of 2020. Next slide. So that was the HAP standards, and now we're going to talk about volatile organic compound regulations for factory applied coatings. Next slide. And I'm staying at a very high level discussion today, just giving you kind of an overview of what's kind of happening out there. We could do spend quite a few hours on all the calculations, et cetera, but maybe just to give you a purview, and then if you want to have me come back next time or sometime in the future, I'd be happy to dive deeper. But what is really causing this? What is the onus? Why are states adopting more stringent VOC standards? It's the ozone standard, the National Ozone Standard, which has been modified about every 5 years. And the problem, of course, is when the states are not complying with the ozone standard, then they look for VOC or NOx reductions. Coatings is usually one of the first VOC reduction rules that they go after. Architectural industrial maintenance, field applied, and then of course factory applied coatings. And then you could the states can go after permits. They could, of course, limit, I'll talk about this later, but limit the type of solvents that are used for cleaning, they could require, actually having covers on tanks that contain coatings, and then of course add-on controls. And then of course you got the coating application facilities. You could expand the applicability to pull in smaller facilities. You could do more stringent add-on control requirements. Again, the solvent cleaning, more efficient spray guns, and of course the actual VOC limit that would apply to a facility, VOC in this case, but they could ratchet down that limit as well. Next slide. And what the states tend to do is they use the EPA control technique guidelines. These are guides or guidelines that EPA has put together for the various substrate or industries, and they're called CTGs. And we really don't have federal standards for the VOC for factory applied coatings. It's left up to the states, but the states can use these guidelines. We as an industry appreciate that these are out there, and what we're looking for is consistency. It would be great, from our perspective, if Indiana had similar regulations to Illinois, to Ohio, for example, so at least we know, companies can generally be assured that the regulations, the definitions, the standards are generally from one state to the next are somewhat consistent. And these are generally based on rules out of California, especially the South Coast Air Quality Management District in Los Angeles, and of course the Bay Area in San Francisco. They've got very stringent regulations out in California. EPA looked to those regulations when developing these guidelines. And here's just a listing of some of the substrates, very similar to what we talked about with the HAP standards, miscellaneous metal, plastic parts, auto light duty truck, everything through, say, large appliance. And these rules, lower VOC limits, work practice standards, essentially keeping covers on storage tanks, spray gun requirements, how do you clean the spray guns, all of these could be incorporated into the new, more stringent requirements. And here's just a sampling of some of the states. Generally, we're talking about, of course, California being more stringent, the Northeast corridor, the Midwest, Utah, Colorado, Maricopa County, of course, Arizona. So they've all been generally, as the standards get more stringent, or ozone standards get more stringent, then the states and local areas have to, essentially get more VOC reductions, and then they make these more stringent. And then we probably will see more states come online as they need to get more reductions. For example, like Colorado and Utah recently, they've come on to the radar because of their air quality issues. Next slide. I did want to mention, I don't know if anybody on the phone actually has any operations or sells any coatings or has any affiliation with what happens in Los Angeles, California. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of the regulations start out there, but I think it's important because they do set a trend. What happens there tends to move across the country at some point in time. Los Angeles do have on the books that they're going to make the following rules. They've made adhesives. They are looking at marine coatings, aerospace, metal parts, wood coating products, and then I'm going to talk one slide today about solvent cleaning operations. South Coast has committed to removing various exemptions, lowering the applicability. Many of these rules to be applicable, you have to be a major source, and depending on what they set that major source threshold at, is it 250 tons per year, 250 tons per year? The districts or the states can lower that applicability, therefore pull in more facilities. Clearly, they're talking about maybe some lower VOC limits, and I am going to spend one slide about some new VOC methods that are that South Coast had developed that you maybe want to be aware of. Next slide. And that is so most of the rules we have utilize method 24. That's a oven method. Many people call it. You take a coating, you weigh it, you put it in an oven at 100 degrees C, I believe. And then you weigh it after you put it in the oven, and then you subtract out, and you can figure out the difference. And in theory, that would be any kind of water, exempt compounds, or VOCs. And that's how, or theoretical, a coating manufacturer could, essentially based on how the coating is formulated, could tell the applicator that here's the theoretical VOC concentration. But if it ever came down to an enforcement situation, a state or local district would look to method 24. The problem with method 24, when you get down to less than 150 gram per liter, method 24 becomes a little bit problematic. You can actually get negative VOC concentrations. It really has to do with how water is applied, or how water is dealt with in the calculation in many of these rules. So South Coast, they developed a new method. It's called method 313. There's also a sister method that was developed in California, ASTM D6886. And I mentioned here this is for field applied, but in general, it's our understanding that South Coast, Los Angeles, will utilize this method. It's likely that other standards, factory applied coating standards in the future may incorporate this, as well as the ASTM D6886 method in the future. Both of these are gas chromatograph methods. You take a coating, you inject it into essentially a machine, and you essentially see the blips on the screen. You add up the peaks, and you get essentially a VOC number. So bottom line, it's good for lower VOC coatings. One problem that I'll mention here today is that the South Coast method, it redefines what a VOC is. They use a VOC marker. It's called methyl palmitate. And we are concerned that by using this marker, it tends to make coatings a little bit higher VOC content. So if I take a coating, I use method 24, I may get 100 gram per liter. If I use South Coast 313, I might get 110, 120. It sometimes, depending on what is being used in the coating, it could be substantially higher. So I just want to make everybody aware that there are some other test methods that can potentially come onto the radar screen in the future, and there could be some problems with these. So if you do have operations in California, and we think this probably comes to the Northeast in the next couple of years as well, it'd be good to try out some of these methods to see how they compare with the theoretical and or the method 24. Next slide. And then I think the last slide I have today, I wanted to talk about industrial solvent cleaning regulations. So where coatings are applied, we of course we have the HAP and we have the VOC standards for the actual coating, but any kind of spray guns, any kind of storage tank, any lines, essentially any general cleaning that would occur in that facility could now be subject to so-called industrial solvent cleaning regulations. There was a CTG, which I mentioned a couple slides ago, developed by EPA back in 2006. These are generally applied to facilities that have a potential or actual emissions of either 15 pounds per day or 3 tons per year of VOCs from industrial cleaning operations or solvents on a 12-month rolling basis. That's pretty high number. I mean, not a lot of facilities is going to be your bigger coating application facilities that are going to be cleaning that much. But if you are subject to that, the applicability, the VOC limit is 50 gram per liter, or there's a maximum composite vapor pressure of 8 meters of mercury at 20 degrees Celsius. So 50 gram per liter is, I think, what is it, 3% by weight in generally? It's a very, very, from our perspective as an industry, that's a very, very low VOC concentration. And if anybody's ever worked with, you know, say adhesives or paints, you know, once those coatings tend to start to attack or dry, you know, that you need a pretty good solvent to be able to remove it. So one of the reasons I'm talking about this today is that for coating manufacturing operations, where actually our facilities were actually manufacturing the coatings, we were able to get some exemptions from this industrial solvent cleaning rules in many of the states, or maybe some higher VOC limits, because again, it's very difficult once a coating starts to cure to be able to remove that. So I just want to be aware, everybody be aware that you know, not only does the coating have a VOC regulation, but also the when you go to clean any kind of spray gun or other, you know, pieces of equipment within that facility, please be aware that you see the states listed here below. Many of these have these solvent cleaning regulations, and we think that other states in the future, for example, New York just adopted. You'll see more of these in the future. So just want to make that aware, everybody aware that you know, these type of regulations are out there. So that's the last slide that I have today. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Anybody still out there?
Oh, don't tell me. I'm out of my...
This is Donovan. Certainly appreciate this information. Sorry about the notifications that started popping up. I finally figured out how to stop those. Is there any look at any of the area source standards, residual risk review that might apply, because most of this was on the MACT side, and
right,
then it may carry over into the area source side?
Great question. I know that I don't have an answer for you right now, but I think you're right. I think there is a connection to, so we're talking major source, you know, what I talked about today, and then your area source would be, you know, facilities less than 10 ton or less than, you know, 25 tons combined. I don't know the schedule on that. If it is that, if EPA is required to do that, they missed their deadlines on those as well. And then maybe even to make it a little bit more complicated, you've got the new source performance standards for many of these substrates that I mentioned, like miscellaneous metal parts and auto and light duty truck. There is the new source performance standards that EPA was supposed to modify or revisit those, and they missed the deadlines on those as well. So I don't have an answer on the area source. Again, if that is needs to be done, it's going to take EPA some time here, especially because they need to do the new source performance standards as well. Does that help at all? Yeah,
it does some. I was thinking, especially when they did some redefinition of like the 0.1%, 1%. One I'm most familiar with is the 6H rule, where it's 0.1% of the cadmium, chromium, lead, nickel, and 1% of the manganese.
Right.
So there's a couple of questions from the chat.
Sure.
Sarah in New Hampshire notes that there's a wood coater in her area that can't find a coating to meet the standards, and is asking if any other states have run into a similar issue.
Well, coming from the industry, you know, that is one of our taglines, is that, you know, as regulations become more stringent, yes, the industry has been able to come up with new technology, waterborne technology, or two-part, two-component coatings. I hear that quite often, especially companies that are used to traditional coatings, or maybe a niche applicator. They do guitars, for example, and they've always been used to this one oil-based product that they've used for many years, and now all of a sudden that product doesn't meet the VOC limit anymore. It's a big change. They have to there probably are products out there. I would recommend, if you want to connect them with me, I can always reach out to one of our members, our manufacturers, and they might be able to help. But it probably is going to require a change. Move from that oil-based product that they had in the past to say a waterborne or a two-part. It's going to, they're going to probably have to retrain their applicators. They'll probably have to do, reconfigure their operations, and learn how to, deal with a different coating. So bottom line, I hear it all the time. There are solutions, but that facility probably is going to have to, put some time and effort and money into, converting into different technology.
Okay. I'll get to Tony's question in a moment, because Belinda in Idaho has a related question to that. She asks, are there any new low VOC cleaning solvents being developed, and is there a list somewhere to find those?
Good question. I think so. In some regard, yes. I think there are. So hopefully people are aware of I mentioned a couple times, the South Coast Air Quality Management District. They have I believe they call it their, it's their certified cleaning products, or they essentially have a list of products that they've done some certification or testing of. I'd be happy, Mark, could I provide that link to you and then you provide it back through, or does that make sense? Or
Yeah.
Okay.
You can provide it actually both to Donovan and me, and one of us will get it out.
Yeah. So I know that there's I know that South Coast, because they essentially set that standard. They're the reason why it's set at 50 gram per liter, for example. They've done some work with the low VOC cleaners. I can't attest to how effective they are. We argue, and kind of I mentioned in there, that at least for coating manufacturing, adhesives and inks and resins, we have problems with the low VOC cleaning products, because one, it could impact the actual formulation. Some companies move to acetone. Then you have a flammability concern. And we just find that a higher VOC traditional solvent works much better. You don't have to use as much. Sometimes you get into these lower VOC products, you have to use more of it, and there could be other concerns about being caustic or et cetera. But yes, South Coast has a list. I'd be happy to provide that to Mark and Donovan, and we can get that through to you.
Excellent.
David, do you know? You mentioned acetone. There's a few other solvents that are also considered VOC exempt, at least under the Clean Air Act. Are any of those possibly promising as substitutes?
It's a great question. I was actually tempted to talk about exempt compounds in this presentation, but generally we're talking about the Midwest. Unfortunately, not really. Many acetone, methyl acetate, many of these are more volatile, and some of them are more more flammable. And if you haven't heard, there are some concerns about health issues with some products. So at the end of the day, in our industry, mineral spirits and some of the other ones were, no, I think some companies tried to move to acetone, but some of them have run into issues. I don't think it's a complete. There could be blends. Maybe I'll leave it with, there are some blends of some exempt compounds that some of the compounds that you're going to see on that list from South Coast are just blends of exempt compounds. That's how they get there. But is it the perfect solution? At least from my perspective, it's not. So.
I assume that would include, you may have referenced indirectly, the parachlorobenzotrifluoride?
Correct, PCBTF, correct. Yeah.
that has the potential health issues, even though it's
correct. Yep. And then the other one is tertiary butyl acetate, TBAC. TBAC and PCBTF. Maybe I'll just summarize it in throughout the entire country. All of these exempt compounds are exempt. Where the industry really needs it and where the limits are the lowest is in California. And some of the districts in California did not exempt those compounds that we're talking about, or potentially could pull the exemption for some of those compounds, therefore leaving the industry in jeopardy. So we've got, as an industry, some serious concerns in California with these. We've utilized the exempt compounds to essentially meet the low VOC standards out in California, both from a coating and a cleanup perspective. And now, if the districts want to either don't provide the provisions for the exemption and/or take it away, then we're kind of left in jeopardy. So we have some major issues or concerns with how California districts operate or deal with the exemptions.
Now, going back into, or staying, I guess, with cleaning, some states basically will allow any type of cleaning as long as you don't atomize, say, like through a spray gun. But other states, like Indiana, require you to use an enclosed gun cleaning device. Does that provide challenges for those trying to clean spray guns?
So I'm more from the manufacturing side, so I can speak to it a little bit. I think a lot of the regulations you're talking about probably have been around for a while. I think the industry's got a pretty good handle on it. I know there are challenges with guns. There's a lot of different operations, or a lot of different regulations that apply to cleaning of the guns, and what is it a waste, and all kinds of point of determination and all that. We have a whole discussion on that. But these new regulations that I mentioned in my presentation, these are yet another layer of regulations, not just for the guns, but it's the actual lines and any kind of tank where the coating is stored or used in production, and generally within the facility. Any type of equipment could be subject to the 50 gram per liter that I just mentioned. So it's yet another. It's a newer, but it's an overlay of another set of regulations that facilities need to be aware of. I hope that helps.
Yeah. Well, the 50 gram per liter, is that a California thing, or is that a non-attainment thing, or both?
So that came from California that's why it's so low. It's actually 25 gram per liter in some of the districts in California. EPA, I think, maybe bumped it up to 50 when they did that control technique guideline. But no, that would be, regardless of what attainment area you're in, that's the standard that's being adopted in many of these regulations. I didn't list them all here. There are quite a few exemptions, depending on the industry you're talking about, like printing and like I said, coating manufacturing. So there are quite a few exemptions, and the applicability is quite high as well. I mean, 15 pounds per day just from cleaning, or 3 tons per year. It's got to be a pretty big facility to hit that applicability.
And that would just be based on usage minus waste, I assume.
I think it would be kind of like the volatile, usage. Yes. How do I say this? It's essentially the emissions. So yeah, if I'm using X amount of solvent and I know that it's evaporating, I don't have all the calculations in front of me. How do you essentially comply with it? But it would be the emissions from the usage of those solvents for cleaning.
Right, but you could just discount the waste that's going off-site as a waste solvent.
Correct. It's just the emissions, correct.
So Tony had a question a bit ago. His was, are VOC CTGs limits necessary for NOx limit states like North Carolina that EPA has agreed could relax their RVP gasoline standards?
Good question. I know a lot of states are going NOx heavy, we call it, where in the past 20 years or a couple decades, states have really, when they wanted to reduce the ozone. They've moved towards VOC reductions. We're starting to see many states that realize that when you have like a NOx limited atmosphere, you get more bang for the buck by going down a NOx limitation regulation as opposed to a VOC. My understanding when I see the map of states that are out of attainment for ozone, at least recently, they've still gone outside of California. They tend to still go down the route of VOC reduction. So I don't exactly know how to answer that question. I would think that maybe in the future, I would in this, we call it kind of a suite of regulations. Most states will adopt the coating regulations, this industrial surface coating. At some point in time, maybe they'll start switching over to just NOx based. But my understanding is that most states will probably adopt these standards. I hope that helps.
All right. Any other questions out there? Harry from New York shared pretty much an answer back to Sarah. When pressed, there are VOC compliant coatings found, although they can be more expensive.
True. Yeah, because you're using different, more challenging chemistries, or the industry has to find. Yeah, yep. That could be a case. Yes.
All right. If there are no further questions, we certainly appreciate your presentation today and answering questions on the residual risk technology review and other things in relating to the coating industry. It's always great to have you on and discuss these issues with us.
Great. I'm happy to participate in the future as well.
So yeah.
Go ahead, Mark.
Go ahead.